Israeli strikes on Iran, the US trading fire with Yemeni rebels, and is the IDF pulling out of Gaza? We'll explore all of that and more, but first let's get some context with the top stories from this week. Crappy New Year's. This New Year's, Israeli media highlighted a midnight rocket attack on Tel Aviv, while Aljazeera English focused on Gazans ringing in the new year running from bombs. But Aljazeera Arabic's headline Gaza story proudly displayed video of Hamas's midnight barrage on Tel Aviv. Why the different bent on different Al Jazeera sites? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. No duh. Israel's policy is generally to maintain a wall of silence around activities in other countries. But this week, former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett caused an uproar in Israel after confirming 2 Israeli attacks on Iranian targets during his year as Prime Minister. In a country seeking security and having lost faith that the current government can best provide that, Bennett's remarks were criticized as inappropriate politicking during a war. Assassination Nation. A drone strike in Beirut killed Hamas's deputy leader there, who, according to Israel, was Hamas's prime orchestrator of West Bank terrorism. And while Israel has not officially taken responsibility for the assassination, Israel's Mossad chief responded to the story saying, "Those who took part in the October 7th massacre signed their own death warrant." Hezbollah, who has been carrying out a relatively low-level but growing war with Israel in the last few months, had previously warned Israel that any assassinations in Lebanon would be met with force. The Israeli military said it's on high alert as the US sent a senior envoy to Lebanon to try to keep things from getting further out of control.
Everything is under control.
Houthi patootie. Houthi rebels angry over the war in Gaza, and the US battled on the high seas as the US Navy rescued a container ship under attack. And the US military pushed for a direct attack on Houthi bases in Yemen, raising the question, is this a regional war? Everyone, and I mean everyone, is concerned about the Middle East sliding closer to the edge of a wider regional conflict. See, Israel and Iran have been engaged in a shadow war for years. Mutual hacking, assassinations, covert maritime sabotage, Red Sea piracy, a proxy conflict through Hezbollah and Hamas, and the occasional bombing in Syria targeting Iranian weapons and military personnel. And while the war in Gaza initially looked like an issue between neighbors, Iran-backed Houthi attacks on Israel and international shipping lanes is starting to make this look like a regional conflict. The US military is reportedly pushing for a strike on Houthi sites in Yemen, and Iran this week moved a warship to the Red Sea after the US is sinking Houthi boats. So is it a regional war yet, or still on the cusp? And does it make any difference? Post your thoughts in the comments. The one with the anti-Semitic hypocrisy. David Schwimmer made some friends and enemies this week after sharing the New York Times article that detailed Hamas's use of sexual violence against Israeli women on October 7th. Schwimmer called out a double standard among some women's rights activists, saying they'll fight like hell for all victims of sexual violence unless they're Jews. For many of them, denying it even happened is a convenient way of avoiding compassion and personal responsibility. Speaking of taking responsibility, the IDF apologized for an airstrike from over 2 weeks ago that killed scores of innocent Palestinians, saying that too large a bomb was dropped on the target and that the IDF regrets harm to those not involved. Collateral damage. Harvard University President Claudine resigned this week after a tumultuous few months, starting with criticism of her response to the October 7th massacre, her weak response to anti-Semitism on campus, and finally claims of plagiarism in her academic writing. Leishmania. Israeli soldiers found themselves fighting on a new front this week as a sandfly-borne parasitic disease affected at least 100 IDF troops in Gaza. Cutaneous leishmanias causes skin lesions, but is easily treatable and most likely the soldiers were infected in military staging grounds outside of Gaza. Not this again. In a historic and controversial ruling, the Israeli Supreme Court struck down the newly enacted law that limited the powers of the court to strike down newly enacted laws. You may remember the protests that seemed to be pushing Israel towards civil war, and then Hamas's invasion that unified Israelis. So is this the beginning of the end of that unity? We'll look at some surprising answers to that question later. Bye for now. The IDF announced that while fighting in southern Gaza remains fierce, the military is pulling thousands of soldiers out of northern Gaza and shifting the focus there to smaller, targeted operations. But is that a cover story for something else? More on that as we head over to... This week we'll take a deeper dive into the dueling narratives around the withdrawal, reports on sexual violence on October 7th, and the judicial overhaul. First up, withdrawal or retreat. The IDF announced it was withdrawing 5 brigades from Gaza, and while they don't release numbers, the New York Times says 1 brigade is roughly 4,000 troops. And while everyone agrees the withdrawal is happening, the reasons vary depending on what you read. For Israeli readers, the withdrawal has a few driving forces. First, with Hamas's military capabilities in the northern Gaza Strip largely defeated, there is no longer a need for so many troops there. Second, after the massive mobilization of troops in October, the Israeli economy took a serious hit as hundreds of thousands of reserve troops spent their days in uniform rather than at their desk or spending money on dinners out. Third, with the IDF announcing the war will take upwards of a year, reserve soldiers need to gather strength for upcoming activities in the next year. But Aljazeera, funded by Hamas supporter Qatar, was quick to announce that the resistance forced Israel to begin a gradual withdrawal from Gaza. Aljazeera's military correspondent asserts that the retreat is due to the inability of these forces to advance. Saudi Arabia's Al Arabiya characterized the withdrawal as a major failure by the Israeli army, and points to the difficulty of operations there. The outlet implied Israeli losses were forcing the move, saying when the losses of any military unit reach 40%, it is considered unqualified to go into combat, and that Israeli forces were unable to control the area. Take it or leave it. Sexual violence on October 7th. The Wall Street Journal and New York Times both published reports with updated information and evidence of sexual violence committed by Hamas on October 7th. The articles corroborate Israeli assertions that have been ignored or denied by many Palestinian supporters around the world. Not surprisingly, the articles made headlines in Israel, but yes, surprisingly, they also made it to at least one Arab language outlet, Sky News Arabiya, which is funded by the United Arab Emirates. Now keep in mind, the UAE is a signatory to the Abraham Accords with Israel, and not particularly good friends with Qatar, a supporter of Hamas and media outlet Al Jazeera. With that said, Sky News Arabiya gave an extended summary of the article, while avoiding descriptions of the actual evidence. But none of this made it to other Arab language outlets, including BBC Arabic, even though the BBC has covered the issue in English. But Arab media outlets did manage to pick up other stories from the Wall Street Journal, with Hezbollah's Propaganda Daily quoting the journal to boast that 230,000 Israelis have been displaced from their homes. Sky News Arabiya published a video report based on a Wall Street Journal article on the scale of destruction in Gaza. That Wall Street Journal article was also covered in Israeli outlets, including Haaretz and Ma'ariv. And finally, let's all be reasonable here. Okay, so for about a year, Israelis were at each other's throats over a government plan to limit the power of the Supreme Court to overrule laws passed by the government. See, about 20 years ago, the Israeli Supreme Court decided that it could overrule government decisions for being unreasonable. For many Israelis, this judicial oversight was a critical failsafe in protecting the rights of minorities from the tyranny of the majority. But for others, this was a vague standard that gave the court nearly unlimited power to obstruct decisions by lawmakers who were democratically elected to create laws. So Israel's parliament narrowly passed a new basic law, or sort of a constitutional amendment in a country without a constitution. This new basic law said that the court can't overrule new basic laws simply for being unreasonable. It was almost like the government was daring the court to overrule the new basic law for being unreasonable, which the government was saying the court no longer had the power to do. And while the 8-7 split that struck down the law seems like a harbinger of future Israeli divisions, a side ruling in the case indicates that things may not be as bad as they seem. That's because the court also ruled on a more fundamental question. Can the Supreme Court overrule basic laws? In a resounding decision, 12 of 15 justices affirmed the court has this power. Go Jewish unity. But all this begs the question, why did the court decide to weigh in on these controversial issues in the midst of a war? So it could be because retiring Chief Justice Esther Hayut was in her final days on the court and wanted to push it through before the court's makeup changed. But Anshel Pfeiffer of Haaretz argued the court's timing was impeccable, saying that at a time of war, when Israel is coming under international criticism and facing accusations of committing war crimes, the ruling is an affirmation of the foundations of Israeli democracy, and that judicial oversight is one of the main arguments shielding Israel from the intervention of international courts. Or maybe it was that ruling on this in the midst of a war was a way to get this controversial ruling out without sparking divisive protests and counter-protests. As David Horowitz in the Times of Israel notes, for now, the war comes first. and it's likely new elections will precede any further government steps on this issue. And now, we'll look at this week in Jewish history. Sunday marks the day in 1369 in Sicily when a new law came into effect forcing Sicily's Jews to wear a special badge to identify them, a harbinger of things to come. Tuesday is the same day in 81 BCE that a political battle in ancient Judea came to a close, as the Sanhedrin, the religious supreme court of the day, was finally cleared of the last of the Sadducees, a sect that denied the oral tradition. Wednesday is the day that in 1795, a Jew in Tripoli, Libya, united competing local factions to oust an evil warlord persecuting Jews and non-Jews alike. Friday is apparently Purim Rome, aka Moed de Piombo, a day of thanksgiving commemorating the day in 1793 when a mob surrounded the Jewish ghetto of Rome and prepared to burn the ghetto to the ground, when suddenly rain came pouring down and ruined the mob's plans. Looking ahead, keep an eye on developments on Israel's northern border and how the US responds to continued Houthi attacks off the coast of Yemen. You may notice if anything big happens because it might mean World War III has begun.